something is happening right now in Australia that most people are completely ignoring. And by the time the mainstream media decides to talk about it openly, it will already be too late for millions of Australians. Today, we're going to break down exactly what's going on, why it matters to every single person watching this, and most importantly, what comes next. Because the Australian housing market has officially reached the point of no return. Let's start with the numbers, because the numbers don't lie. Melbourne, one of Australia's most iconic cities, has just seen a 50% collapse in new construction activity. Think about that for a second. Half. Gone. Builders who were operating last year are shutting their doors, walking away from projects, leaving homebuyers stranded with half-finished homes and empty bank accounts. This isn't a slowdown. This isn't a correction. This is a structural collapse happening in real time, and the ripple effects are going to be felt for decades. Now, you might be wondering, how did we get here? How does a country as wealthy and as stable as Australia end up in a situation where its housing market is crumbling from the inside out? The answer is actually simple, and it starts with something that almost nobody talks about in polite conversation: the absolute failure of policy. For years, Australian governments at both the state and federal level made promises about housing affordability. They promised first homebuyers a pathway into the market. They promised renters protection. They promised that supply would meet demand. Every single one of those promises has been broken. Instead of solving the housing crisis, governments introduced measures that made everything dramatically worse. Take Victoria as an example. The Victorian government, in its infinite wisdom, decided that the best way to fix the housing market was to tax it into submission. Land taxes, stamp duties, short-term rental levies, layer after layer of financial burden piled onto property owners and investors. And here's the thing about investors: love them or hate them, they are the ones who fund rental supply in this country. When you tax investors out of the market, renters pay the price. And right now, renters across Melbourne and Sydney are paying that price every single week. But the story gets worse. In New South Wales, homeowners are now being hit with land tax bills of up to $13,000. $13,000 per year, on top of their mortgage, on top of their council rates, on top of the cost of living crisis that is squeezing every Australian household from every direction at once. People who bought their properties 15 or 20 years ago, ordinary working people, teachers, nurses, small business owners, they are now receiving tax bills that they simply cannot afford to pay. And when they can't pay, they're being forced to sell, forced out of homes they've owned for decades, forced into a rental market that is already at breaking point. And speaking of breaking point, let's talk about what's happening to investors right now, because this is the part of the story that should terrify everyone. Investors across New South Wales and Victoria are going bankrupt. Not the big property developers, not the billionaires. Ordinary Australians who bought one or two investment properties to secure their retirement, they are going under. The combination of rising interest rates, brutal land taxes, falling rental yields, and a construction sector in freefall has created a perfect financial storm. And these bankruptcies have consequences that go far beyond the individuals involved. When investors go bankrupt, their properties get sold off. When properties flood the market, prices drop. When prices drop suddenly in an over-leveraged market, the entire system starts to shake. Now here's where it gets really serious. Australia's housing market is not just an economic issue, it's a social crisis. Right now, Australia has one of the lowest rental vacancy rates in its recorded history. In some major cities, the vacancy rate is sitting below 1%. That means for every 100 rental properties in Sydney or Melbourne, fewer than one is available. If you're a renter in this country right now, you already know what this feels like. You're competing against 30, 40, 50 other applicants for a single apartment. You're being asked to pay rents that consume 60-70% of your take home pay. You're watching your quality of life disappear in real time. And the people who should be entering the market as first home buyers, they've given up. A recent survey found that a growing number of Australians under 40 have completely abandoned the dream of homeownership, not put it on hold, abandoned it. These are educated, working, tax-paying Australians who have accepted the reality that in their own country, owning a home is no longer a realistic goal. That is not just a housing statistic, that is a generational catastrophe. When an entire generation stops believing in the future, the social and economic consequences are enormous. Lower birth rates, lower consumer spending, lower investment in communities, higher rates of mental health issues, the housing crisis, and the broader social crisis are completely connected, and Australia is starting to feel that connection right now. Let's talk about construction, because this is where the point of no return really becomes clear. Australia needs to build approximately 1.2 million new homes over the next 5 years just to keep pace with population growth and existing demand. That's the government's own target. And right now, the construction industry is moving in the exact opposite direction. Material costs have exploded. Labor shortages are crippling building timelines. Interest rates have made development financing extremely difficult to secure. And with builders going under at record rates, consumer confidence in off-the-plan purchases has completely collapsed. Nobody wants to put a deposit on an apartment being built by a company that might not exist in 12 months. So you have a market where demand is enormous, supply is shrinking, construction is collapsing, taxes are rising, investors are leaving, and first home buyers are priced out. Every single pressure point is moving in the wrong direction at the same time. That is what point of no return actually means. It doesn't mean the market crashes overnight. It means the structural damage being done right now will take a generation to repair, if it ever gets repaired at all. And what is the government's response? More inquiries, more task forces, more announcements about housing targets that everyone in the industry knows are completely unrealistic. The political will to actually fix this problem, to genuinely reform land taxes, to incentivize construction, to protect renters without destroying the rental supply, simply does not exist. Because fixing the housing crisis in Australia means making decisions that upset powerful interest groups, and no politician in this country has shown the courage to do that. Here is the brutal truth that nobody in power wants to say out loud. Australia's housing market was built on the assumption of permanent growth. Property prices would always go up. Construction would always be profitable. Investors would always stay in the market. Those assumptions are now broken, and when the foundational assumptions of a market break down, the market itself breaks down with them. We are watching that happen right now, in slow motion, in real time. For anyone watching this who owns property, whether it's your family home or an investment, this is not the time to ignore what's happening. The decisions you make in the next 12 to 24 months could define your financial future for the next decade. For anyone renting, understand that the situation is unlikely to get significantly better in the short term. Rental prices may stabilize in some markets, but genuine relief is years away at best. And for anyone who is hoping to buy their first home soon, there may be opportunities emerging as distressed sellers enter the market, but proceed with extreme caution and do your research carefully. Australia is a remarkable country. It has navigated economic crises before, but this housing crisis is different in its scale, its depth, and its complexity. It has been building for 20 years. It will not be solved in 12 months. And the longer governments delay real action, the harder and more painful the eventual reckoning becomes. The point of no return isn't a moment in the future. It's already here. The question now isn't whether Australia's housing market will fundamentally change. It's whether the change will be managed carefully or whether it will be catastrophic. And right now, based on everything we're seeing, the answer to that question should concern every single Australian. If this video gave you something to think about, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And drop in the comments, what do you think Australia's government should actually do about this? Because the conversation has to start somewhere.